On a single night, two elite forces entered the same house, but walked out with completely different stories. In the middle of the Iraqi desert, during operations that officially followed the same rules, something started to feel off. Missions that were supposed to end with strategic captures were ending far too definitively, too fast, too silent, and, curiously, always without survivors. There is an invisible line in war, a line that separates control from chaos, intelligence gathering from elimination, calculated decisions from impulse. And for years, that line was what set highly trained units apart from something much harder to explain. But what happens when that line starts to disappear? Because here we're not talking about ordinary soldiers. We're talking about some of the most highly trained, disciplined, and lethal units in the world. Men prepared to operate under extreme pressure, and precisely because of that, expected to maintain control where no one else could. But at certain moments, something changed. Operations began to follow a strange pattern: fast entries, no clear resistance, no visible effort to capture, just final results, clean, objective, and hard to question, at least on paper. Except that outside the reports, another narrative was beginning to emerge: informal accounts, comments exchanged between operators, glances shared after missions. Small details that, on their own, didn't mean much, but together formed something impossible to ignore. If the objective was to gather intelligence, why was no one being captured? If there were multiple occupants, why were there never any witnesses? And more importantly, when everything ends too quickly, what exactly happened inside? As operations continued, the tension between these two approaches began to grow, not because of differences in skill, not due to lack of training, but because of something more subtle and far more dangerous: a difference in mindset. On one side, the belief that a live target is more valuable than a dead one, that information can prevent future attacks, that control is the key to winning a modern war. On the other, a more direct approach, where risk must be eliminated the moment it appears, where hesitation can cost lives, and where the decision is already made before the door is even opened. And it is exactly at this point that things start to get complicated. Because when two completely different ways of seeing the same mission collide, the result is rarely balance, it's conflict, but not an open conflict, a silent one, internal, built mission after mission, until eventually something happens that can no longer be ignored. And when that happens, it's no longer possible to pretend it's just another operation. So the question begins to emerge: what was really happening inside those houses? Why did some missions seem to end before they even began, at least from the perspective of those outside? And more importantly, was this the exception, or had it already become the rule? Because understanding what happened that night requires more than looking at the outcome. It requires going back in time, understanding where these differences came from, how they were built, and why at some point they stopped being just doctrine and started to define what is, or isn't, acceptable on a battlefield. How did two of the most respected forces in the world come to carry out the same mission in such different ways? And when did that difference stop being technical and become moral? Before answering all of that, we need to go back. Back to the beginning. Because this story doesn't start with the operation, it starts long before. And when you understand that beginning, everything that follows stops being surprising and starts becoming inevitable. The heat in the Iraqi desert wasn't just physical. It carried tension, weight, expectation. In 2006, inside a forward operating base near Al-Qaim, Delta Force operators gathered in silence, doing what they always did before a mission: cleaning weapons, checking gear, and observing. But that day, something felt different. They weren't alone. On the other side of the base, another group was preparing: a British detachment, silent, organized, efficient, the kind of presence that didn't need to announce itself to be noticed. And even before any mission began, there was an unmistakable discomfort. It wasn't rivalry, It wasn't competition. It was something deeper, a distrust built not on theory but on reputation. Sergeant First Class Daniel Reeves, a veteran of over a decade in special operations, who had seen just about everything war could offer, watched the British closely. Then he said, in a low voice, something that would sum up everything that followed. "Sir, with all due respect, these guys aren't like us." That statement didn't come out of nowhere. It reflected months of stories circulating among operators, unofficial accounts, missions no one confirmed, but everyone seemed to know about. Operations in southern Iraq, night raids, houses breached, and above all, no survivors. Officially, none of it existed. No reports, no investigations, no evidence. But among special forces, there's an unspoken rule: reputation matters more than paperwork. And at that moment, the British SAS reputation wasn't just about efficiency. It was something more, something many couldn't quite define, but everyone could feel. And this is where the fundamental difference begins. Delta Force was shaped with a clear objective: precision. Every operation, every movement, every decision is guided by a central principle: control. Control of the situation, control of the environment, and most importantly, control of the outcome. That means whenever possible, the objective isn't to kill, it's to capture. Capture means intelligence, it means information, it means turning a target into a source. And in modern warfare, information is more valuable than anybody on the ground. That's how networks are dismantled. That's how larger operations are prevented. But that kind of operation requires something rare on the battlefield: discipline under pressure, knowing when to shoot, and even harder, knowing when not to. On the other side, the SAS operated under a different logic. Not necessarily the opposite, but more extreme, more direct, more final. For them, a threat wasn't something to be studied. It was something to be eliminated. And that difference, which on paper seemed merely doctrinal, in practice changed everything. Because while Delta saw value in a live target, the SAS saw risk. And risk in an environment like Iraq isn't something you manage, it's something you remove, permanently. That mindset didn't emerge by chance. It was shaped by years of operations in environments where hesitation cost lives, where a fraction of a second could mean the difference between going home or not coming back. And over time, that logic became standard. The problem is that when this kind of mindset meets an environment without oversight, without witnesses, and without consequences, it tends to go further. And that's exactly what the rumors suggested. Stories of targets who surrendered and were still killed. Houses where all occupants were eliminated, regardless of whether they were combatants or not. Operations where the line between combat and execution simply ceased to exist. None of this could be proven, but it couldn't be ignored either. And inside that hangar, before the mission had even begun, everyone knew they were about to cross that line. When the operation plan was presented, it seemed simple, almost routine. A high-value target located in an isolated house on the outskirts of Ramadi. Possible links to attacks against coalition forces. Objective: capture if possible. Neutralize if necessary. Standard mission. But there was one detail that changed everything. The SAS would lead the entry. Delta would remain outside, responsible for the perimeter. And in that moment, the tension, once silent, became real. Reeves exchanged a look with his partner, Mike Torres, one of those looks that doesn't need words. Still, Torres spoke. "This isn't going to end well." Reeves didn't disagree, because deep down he already knew. It wasn't the mission that worried him, it was who they were doing the mission with. Meanwhile, on the other side of the base, the British prepared the way they always did. No rush, no unnecessary talk. Every movement calculated, every piece of equipment checked with near-mechanical precision. But there was something different in the way they moved. It wasn't just efficiency, it was the absence of doubt. While many soldiers carry the weight of decisions before even entering combat, those men seem to have already decided everything, as if for them the outcome of the mission wasn't a possibility, but a certainty. And maybe that was exactly what unsettled Delta the most, because war, as brutal as it is, still carries gray areas, difficult decisions, moments where right and wrong aren't so clear. But what happens when someone stops seeing those gray areas? What happens when everything becomes black and white? The answer would begin to reveal itself just a few hours later. When night fell over the desert and helicopters started cutting through the silent sky, two elite units were about to carry out the same mission in completely different ways. And this is where context stops being theory, because until then, everything was rumor, impressions, feelings. But the moment the operation begins, everything changes, because now it's no longer about what was said, it's about what's going to happen, and more importantly, what will be found afterward. Because in the end, the real difference between these two forces wasn't in their training, it wasn't in their equipment, not even in their experience. It was in something much simpler, a line, an invisible line that everyone knew, but not everyone was willing to respect. And the question that begins to emerge here is inevitable. Did that line still exist? Or had it already been erased? And if it had been erased, who did it and why? The operation began like any other, but looking back, nothing about it was normal. The silence felt different, heavier, more aware, as if everyone there, even without saying a word, already knew that night wouldn't end like the others. At 2:17 a.m., the world seemed frozen. The helicopter had already disappeared over the horizon. The sound of the rotor had been swallowed by the darkness. All that remained was emptiness, and the house, still, dark, motionless. Reeves watched through the thermal lens. No movement, no signs of alert. Too perfect, and in war, perfection almost always means trouble. He brought the radio to his mouth. "Perimeter secured. You're clear." On the other end, the response came instantly. "Copy." Cold, mechanical, without any emotional variation, and then the door exploded. The flash tore through the night, and for a few seconds everything seemed normal. Short bursts, coordinated movement, objective communication. It was the kind of entry you see hundreds of times, the kind of operation that becomes almost automatic. But then, the screams came. And that's when everything changed, because those weren't combat screams. They weren't the sounds of men reacting to a threat. They were different, more desperate, more human. Reeves froze. His mind tried to rationalize it. Maybe civilians in panic, maybe confusion, maybe more gunfire, more screams. And then silence. Too fast, always too fast. Torres, beside him, spoke almost in a whisper. That was quick. Reeves didn't answer. He kept watching, waiting, as if something was still about to happen. But nothing came, and that was the worst possible sign. "Too fast," he finally said. The radio crackled again. "House cleared. All targets neutralized." Reeves pressed the button hard. "Confirm. All neutralized? No detainees?" Silence. 1 second, 2. "Negative. No detainees." And in that moment, something broke. Because that wasn't just efficiency, it was absence. Absence of control, absence of judgment, absence of any attempt to gather intelligence. Intel had indicated multiple occupants, possible non-combatants, possible sources, and yet, no survivors. Reeves exchanged a look with the commander. No words were needed. They were going in, now. No additional authorization, no waiting. When they crossed the door, the impact hit immediately. It wasn't visual, it was sensory, the smell, gunpowder, metal, blood. But there was something else, something dense, heavy, almost suffocating. As if the entire environment carried the weight of what had just happened. The first body was in the living room, an adult male, probably armed at some point, but not there, not in that moment. The shots were concentrated, precise, final. No signs of a firefight, no marks of resistance, just elimination. Another body in the hallway, same pattern, same silence. And then, as they advanced, reality began to take shape. This wasn't combat. This was total control followed by execution. And then came the bodies that changed everything. A woman collapsed beside the table, empty hands, no sign of threat. A teenager leaning against the wall, eyes open, frozen in the last second of awareness. And in the corner, two children, small, still, silent. Reeves stopped. The world around him simply disappeared. All the training, all the discipline, all operational logic, none of it made sense there. My God. Torres turned his face away. This wasn't combat, and it wasn't. There was no way to justify it, no way to reinterpret it, no way to fit it into any acceptable protocol. Meanwhile, the SAS men moved with an almost disturbing calm, collecting documents, checking equipment, reviewing the environment, as if it were just another successful mission. One of them looked at Reeves. Mission accomplished. But for Delta, that wasn't a mission. It was something entirely different. Reeves walked toward the children, knelt slowly, observed, and there was no doubt. Point-blank shots, no error, no hesitation. He stood up, looked directly at one of the British operators. Who did this? The answer came instantly. Threats eliminated. Reeves felt his body stiffen. That's not a threat, that's execution. The Brit tilted his head slightly. War isn't pretty. And right there, the line disappeared. Not a theoretical line, a real one, visible, the one that separates combat from something far darker. Hours later, back at base, the report was presented. Cold, clean, controlled. Target neutralized, resistance encountered, no friendly casualties. Nothing about civilians, nothing about children, nothing about what really happened. Reeves walked into the command tent, helmet still in hand, and threw it onto the table. This can't stand. The commander didn't even look up. You think I don't know? Then do something. Silence, heavy. I've seen this before. Reeves froze. And I know how it ends. And then came the question no one wanted to answer. And how are you going to prove it? And there it was, the truth. There was no proof, no recording, nothing but conflicting reports. And in war, the official version always wins. The next morning, the decision was made, quietly, no announcement. Delta Force would no longer operate with that SAS detachment. But it didn't end there. Because it wasn't an isolated case, it was a pattern. Months later, Fallujah, another scenario. Same kind of operation. But this time, Delta arrived later, and that was already a problem, because when the SAS arrived first, they almost never left anything behind. Inside the armored vehicle, the atmosphere was different, more tense, more aware. Target at 300 meters. The house was dark, still, too perfect. They're already there, someone said. And everyone understood. The order was clear, capture, alive. Because information was worth more than elimination, but not everyone operated by that logic. The radio clicked. Initiating entry. Vance responded immediately. Negative. Order is capture. Silence, and then copy. But the tone wasn't obedience. Seconds later, explosion. And then gunfire. But not tactical shots, not controlled. It was continuous, heavy, no pause, no strategic precision. Cole looked at Vance. That's not an entry? When Delta went in, it was already over. Too fast, always too fast. The first body was in the hallway, unarmed. Multiple gunshots, no reaction. Further ahead, 3 bodies lined up, as if they had been arranged. One held a phone. Another seemed to have raised his hands. None armed, none reacting. The team moved upstairs, and up there came the final confirmation. 4 bodies. One of them was the target, confirmed. But the others weren't combatants. And then came the detail. The target had a single shot. Clean, precise, execution, but there were marks, bruises, clear signs of interrogation, fast, violent, and then the end. When they came back down, they found the SAS calm, as always. "Took you long enough," Vance responded, controlling every word. "The order was capture. And we got information. And then you killed them all. We eliminated risks." Cole lost control. They were unarmed. Immediate response. Today. Silence. Tomorrow they wouldn't be. And in that moment, everything made sense. To them, there was no difference between potential threat and real threat. Everything was treated as inevitable. Vance stepped forward. "This isn't an operation. This is a purge." The Brit replied, "Exactly." No hesitation, no shame, no attempt to hide it. "There's a line," Vance said. The Brit answered, "That line died the moment we stepped here." Vance replied, "No, you killed it." Silence. Final. Hours later. Same report, same story, same omission, and in that moment, the perception changed completely. It wasn't a mistake. It wasn't excess. It was method. It was choice. It was pattern. Days later, another joint mission was suggested. The answer came immediately. "I'd rather go in alone." Another operator added, "At least that way I know who might kill me." Trust had been destroyed. And in war, that's more dangerous than any enemy. Without trust, there is no coordination. Without coordination, there is no operation. And without operation, there is only risk. Over time, reports began to surface, similar stories, identical patterns, fast entries, no survivors, no witnesses. The reputation grew, but not as admiration, as a warning, as a signal. Because the question changed. It was no longer about the enemy. It was about them. What are they capable of? And worse, what's stopping them from doing it to anyone? And that question never had an answer, because in the end, war doesn't create monsters, it reveals them, and sometimes removes the last barrier that still existed, and when that happens, there are no rules, no limits, no line. There is only the result, and the result is always the same. Silence, and no one left to tell the story. The problem was never just what happened inside those houses, it was what came after. Because in war, what you see on the ground is only half the story. The other half is what people choose to hide. Days after the operation in Fallujah, the silence was no longer just operational, it was institutional. No one spoke directly about what had happened. No official meeting mentioned details. No report went deeper into the facts. But even so, everyone knew. It was that kind of knowledge that doesn't need to be spoken, that moves through glances, through pauses, through sentences that are never finished. Reeves noticed it quickly. The men were different, more closed off, more cautious, less willing to trust, not just the SASD, but anything around them. Because when a line is crossed and nothing happens, the message is clear, it's allowed, and that was the real danger, not what the SAS did, but the fact that no one stopped them. One of the following nights, inside the base, Reeves found Vance sitting alone. No gear, no radio, no mission, just staring into nothing. "You saw the report?" Reeves asked. Vance let out a short laugh. "I did." "And?" "Same as always." Reeves leaned against the wall. "This is going to keep happening." Vance didn't answer immediately. He knew, but hearing it out loud made it real. "It already is," he finally said. Silence. Heavy, dense. "Do you trust them?" Reeves asked. Vance looked at him. Took a few seconds before answering. "I trust that they'll do exactly what they always do." And that answer said everything. Because there was no more doubt, no more benefit of the doubt, only certainty. Certainty that if they were in the same space, the rules could change, and in joint operations, That is unacceptable. In the days that followed, an informal decision began to take shape. Delta teams started avoiding joint missions. Requests for cooperation began to be declined, and when they couldn't refuse, they went in with distance, with caution, with distrust. But the problem went beyond tactical trust. It was something deeper, more dangerous. It was moral. Because at some level, everyone there started asking the same question: if we were in their place, would we do any different? And that question didn't have a comfortable answer, because war changes people. It distorts limits. It reshapes what is acceptable. And sometimes what starts as an exception becomes the pattern. A week later, a new mission came up. Another target, another house, another almost identical scenario. But this time there was a condition: the SAS would be involved. The briefing was quick, clear objective, high-value capture. But before the commander could finish, one of the Delta operators interrupted. "Are we operating with them?" The silence that followed was revealing. "Yes," the commander replied. The operator took a deep breath. "Then I'd rather not go." The entire room froze. It wasn't common for someone to refuse a mission, but this wasn't about fear. It was about principle. "Explain," the commander said. The operator looked straight at him. "I don't know what they consider a threat." Silence. Another operator added, "And I don't know if, in the middle of the operation, we might become one." That hit the room like a blunt impact, because for the first time, someone said out loud what everyone was thinking. The commander closed his eyes for a second. He understood, they all did, but there was something bigger. There always is. "The mission stands," he said. And that ended the discussion, but it didn't solve the problem. That night before deployment, Reeves was checking his gear when Torres approached. "You going?" he asked. "Do I have a choice?" Reeves replied. Torres stayed silent for a few seconds. "If it goes wrong," Reeves looked up. "We walk," Torres finished. And that agreement, simple and direct, carried more weight than any official order. Because at that moment the priority was no longer the mission, it was survival, even from their own allies. During insertion, the atmosphere was different. No conversation, no lightness, only focus and tension. When they reached the observation point, the house was already there. Same pattern, same silence. But this time, there was something more. A constant feeling that they were late, and that is never a good sign. The radio clicked. "This is Bravo 6. We're in position." Reeves responded, "Hold. Coordinated entry." Silence, and then, "Negative. Initiating now." Reeves closed his eyes for a second. "Damn it!" Explosion, and then gunfire. But this time something was different. There were more shots, more chaos, more time. It wasn't fast, and that was worse. When Delta went in, the scene wasn't clean. It was messy, bodies scattered, bullet marks in every direction, signs of resistance, but also clear signs of execution. A man on the ground, still breathing, wounded, trying to speak. Reeves moved toward him quickly. "Don't shoot," he said. But before he could do anything, a shot echoed behind him. The man stopped moving. Reeves turned immediately. An SAS operator was lowering his weapon. "He was going to talk," Reeves said, controlling his voice. The Brit replied, "He already did." And right there was no more doubt, no more interpretation, no more gray area. It was choice, consistent, repeated, final. Torres stepped closer to Reeves. "It's over." And he wasn't talking about the operation. He was talking about something bigger. Hours later, back at base, no one argued, no one questioned, no one tried to change anything. Because they already knew. It wasn't going to change. That same night, Reeves wrote his report. Different, detailed, complete. For the first time, he documented everything. Every body, every piece of evidence, every inconsistency. But before sending it, he stopped, stared at the screen, for long seconds, and then close the file without saving, because deep down, he knew nothing would happen. And that was the most dangerous moment of all, not when the line was crossed, but when crossing it stopped mattering. Days later, the separation between the units became final, no official announcement, no document, but clear, irreversible. Delta operated alone, SAS operated alone, and that's how it stayed. But the story didn't end there, because stories like this never end. They just disappear, filed away, forgotten, or worse, normalized. And that's what makes it even more dangerous, because when something extreme becomes routine, it stops shocking, stops being questioned, and starts being accepted. And when that happens, the next line disappears too, and then another, until there are none left. And then war stops being about objectives and becomes about the complete absence of limits. And at that point, it no longer matters who is right or who is wrong, because everyone has already lost. And the most terrifying part of all is that for those inside it, it didn't feel wrong, it felt necessary, it felt logical, it felt inevitable. And maybe that's the hardest part to accept, because it means that under certain conditions, anyone can get there. Anyone can cross that line and keep walking as if nothing ever happened. And if that's true, then the final question isn't about the SAS or Delta or that war. The question is something else, something far more uncomfortable, far more personal, far more real. Where is your line? And more importantly, would you recognize the exact moment it disappears, or would you only realize when it's already too late?